Now, of course, you'll hear a lot of right-wingers complain about how liberals tend to, of course, take more money from the government than they pay in. Oh, those moochers, those people on welfare, they're taking all the money. They're taking all the money. It's kind of funny because studies have shown that blue states tend to pay more into taxes, into government programs, than red states. Well, it turns out that there's another study on this from Pew Charitable Trusts that show that, oh, look, states that actually are opposed to President Obama or Republican states have, of course, taken more money from the federal government, are actually more dependent on the federal government than states that voted for Obama. Oh, surprise, surprise. Now, this is reported in The Hill. States that voted against President Obama twice, not once or twice, are more dependent on the federal government, according to an analysis of new data released by the Pew Charitable Trusts on Monday. All told, the average state that voted against Obama twice relied on federal funding for an average of 33% of its budget. 33.8%. Wow, that's a third of the budget that just happens to come from the federal government. Now, among the 27 states that voted for Obama twice, federal grants made up 29% of the average state budget. The report shows that 7 years after the beginning of the economic recovery, states across the country are more reliant on federal dollars to cover their costs than before the recession. Now, that's a big problem, right? This is an actual issue that's affecting people in the states. Why? Well, they can't get good jobs. A lot of the good jobs are gone. A lot of the good paying middle-class jobs don't exist anymore. Okay? That has to do a lot with manufacturing. Look, I'm in Michigan. I've seen a lot of good paying jobs either get eliminated or they come back with much lower rates of pay. A job that might get you $13 an hour, or $14 or $15 in the manufacturing sector come back around $9, $10, $11 an hour, capping out. That's abysmal. That is certainly not a living wage, right? And it's certainly not good for the millions of Americans that made up the middle class of the tax base. So that's why you're seeing more of a increase in state budgets not being made up by the taxpayers of the state, but taxpayers of other states and the federal government. Now, Pew found that federal dollars account for 30.8% of state budgets in 2014, the lowest level since the recession hit. But the share of federal dollars in the state coffers is still higher than in 2008, the start of the financial crisis, when states relied on federal money to account for 27.8% of their budgets. Now, most states have balanced budget amendments, right, where they're forced by their state constitution to balance the budget. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, they're going to take money from the federal government and do it. Now, this is why, and this ties into why Republicans always talk about, let's do the block grant for Medicaid, for example. Let's do the block grant for food stamps, for any kind of welfare, right? I did a report earlier that there are a lot of states that are taking 10F money that's supposed to go for welfare and job training to get people off welfare and back to work. Well, a lot of these states are taking that and going, oh, we got a block grant of welfare. Let's plug it into our budget and not help poor people. Let's plug our state budget to counteract the giant tax cuts we just gave to the local businesses, the local large corporations, and rich people in the state. That's why block grant programs don't work. And this is why I think you're seeing a lot of this in the states that rely so much on federal money to balance their budget. Now, let's see. The Pew survey says that the federal share of state budgets spiked between 1996 as the economy recovered from a recession, again in 2001, 2004, basically taking the federal money in these places and plugging their budget holes with it. Now, Ann Stauffer, director of the Fiscal Federalism Project at Pew Charitable Trust, says during recessionary periods, the federal share of state budgets tends to rise because the state revenue drops and there's sometimes federal stimulus money. Which, look, there's a lot of people that argued against the stimulus. I think it was effective. I think it was effective in trying to stop job losses and keep people from, look, if you lose your job, you're already on slippery slope. When it comes to a bad recession where jobs are very scarce, that federal money is literally a lifesaver, or these federal programs are a lifesaver. And of course, without government funding from the federal level coming in to help these people in the states, well, these states will use that money instead of helping people. They'll either cut programs or they'll use block grant money to plug their budget holes and not worry about poor people. And those, of course, are huge problems. Now let's get to the Republican states. Republican states, they say, rely more heavily on federal dollars as a share of their budgets than do more Democratic states, largely because southern states especially are more likely to have a higher percentage of residents living in poverty. Well, gee, I wonder why. I wonder if that has anything to do with austerity. I wonder if that has to do with people like governors like Governor Sam Brownback in Kansas running the purest experiment of trickle-down economics that you could find. And what happened? Well, their state's going broke. They've had to cut education pretty much to the bone, and they still don't have enough money. Now they have to cut other programs. Anything that helps poor people, they've cut. They've cut university funding. They've cut funding to regular schools. I mean, Kansas is a mess. They're a mess. And they're the experimentation of trickle-down economics in its purest form. And it just shows you that it doesn't work. Now, Mississippi and Louisiana also both rely on federal grants to account for more than 40% of their annual budgets. Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Georgia get more than 36% of their budgets from the federal government. About 2/3 of all federal grants go toward funding Medicaid programs, which is good. States like Mississippi and Louisiana have higher percentage of residents receiving Medicaid and a lower percentage of residents paying income taxes. Well, once again, you've got so many poor people that don't have opportunity. Now, notice this happens a lot in Louisiana, Mississippi, right? Well, there's also a larger share of poor African American people, right? Well, these people don't have opportunity. So, there's a little bit of racism left over from eras like Jim Crow, and a lot of studies that show that, look, African Americans, there's that one study where African American names are rejected more often on job applications than white sounding names, even though they have the same kind of qualifications. That does impact poverty. If you can't get a good job, if you can't get a job that's good enough to get out of poverty, then you're going to stay in poverty. It's the same thing. It's sort of the same argument of why you need to raise the minimum wage. A lot of these same states have lower minimum wages and lower corporate taxes and lower taxes on the rich. You've got poverty, and then you've got a lot of people who can't find good jobs and have to support themselves. They'll have to get on these federal programs like Medicaid. And, of course, in order to balance their budgets, they've got to take more federal money from the government. That's why they're moochers, right? Because they're not doing these things. There are simple things to do. Raise the minimum wage. Create opportunity for these people to be able to work. They're not doing this. They're not passing legislation to help people. In fact, they're doing more austerity. They're cutting more people off. And that's not the right way to go. Now, I want to give you an example. New York, where everybody seems to be complaining about, well, everybody as in conservatives, tend to be complaining about how New York, too much taxes, right? Well, they have a big Medicaid program, right? But they rely less on the federal government because it has a relatively strong tax base. Now, let me ask you a question. If New York is this sort of liberal tax hell that Republicans tend to refer it as, how come Wall Street's there? How come how come Trump is there and still rich? Well, it turns out you have a strong base, a strong tax base. You also have a strong local economy that doesn't rely as much on the federal government. Not only that, but, let me go to the programs that are funded mostly by the government. You have transportation programs, money for public schools, and funding for TANF, right, which is the welfare program. Those are major sources of federal grants that are made to the state. Now, North Dakota, now this was interesting. I mentioned that a lot of Republican states, a lot of red states, rely a lot on federal government. There is one exception, and that's North Dakota. North Dakota is actually the least reliant on federal dollars for its budget. To 16.8% of North Dakota's 2014 budget was made up of federal grants. Now, you might look at that and say, well, see, Republican economics does work. Not necessarily, because North Dakota is an oil state. It's very oil rich. And we had an oil boom. Now we have an oil glut, which means that North Dakota is not going to be doing well. In fact, right now they face a budget deficit now that the price of oil has fallen so dramatically. Meaning that the share of federal government revenue that will be used to balance its budget is going to be very, very high. It's going to be much higher than before. Virginia, Connecticut, Hawaii, and Nevada all rely on federal money for less than a quarter of their budgets, the Pew research shows, and the share of federal dollars going to the states went up slightly between 2013 and 2014 as money for the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act began to trickle in. Stauffer said the share of federal money in state budgets is likely to grow when data from 2015, the first full year of medical expansion, or the Medicaid expansion, becomes available. So there you have it. Seems like most of red states seem to be relying a lot more, but look, these results show that a lot of these states rely a lot on the federal government. So you've got to see that the federal government plays a huge role in helping states balance their budgets. So you see a Republican or a Democratic governor saying, I balance the budget, just know that at least a third of that money or a quarter of that money comes from taxpayers from other states. No state is truly independent. We are all the United States. And if anything shows that, it's this. Hey everybody, if you like this video, then please like this video and share. And if you want to see more like this, then please hit that subscribe button below.